amygdala, and then right behind it, these bones would be palatines, exactly. And the palatines come back and they actually kind of wrap around here. And so these are the palatines in here as well. And this is the primary palate, this is the secondary palate. So what's happened is these palatines have grown around and formed this shelf of bone here to form that secondary palate, whereas they also lie down here on the primary palate. Does that make sense? Okay. You see that at all? Okay. Okay. Whew. So that was a quick tour. Do we have any time left? We do. Good. Okay. Inside the skull, when you brought me this, thank you. In some ways, I think this is going to be a little bit better just because it's not so broken up as that one for right now. There are three so-called cranial fossae, or regions of the cranial cavity. There's the caudal cranial fossa here, the middle, and the anterior. So caudal, middle, anterior. And those are for different parts of the brain. So the cerebellum sits in the caudal cranial fossa, and the cerebrum in the middle, and then the olfactory bulbs sit up in the anterior cranial fossa. Tentorium is this shelf of bone here that roofs over the cerebellum. So that's shelf. And that's actually a carnivore character to have an ossified tentorium. Other mammals just have connective tissue there. The internal acoustic meatus is this hole in the, what part of the temporal bone is this? It's the hard stony part, so we call it the petrosal or petrous part of the temporal. Yep, so that's here. And this is the hole where the auditory nerve comes out of the inner ear and goes to the brain. That's internal acoustic meatus. The sella turcica is a great thing. It's this little kind of concavity here that sits in the floor of the cranial cavity. It's in the basosphenoid bone, this little area right in here. And in Latin, sella turcica means Turkish saddle, because I guess it looks the shape of it like a Turkish saddle that the Turks used to use. But this is where the pituitary gland sits, right there. It's in the sella turcica. Sphenoidal air sinus. Oh, yeah, actually I'm liking this cat better. So here's the sphenoid, and there's a space inside of it, and that's the sphenoidal sinus. And that's just something that mammals do with their skulls, is they have these cavities that are air-filled within the bones of the skull that connect up to the nasal cavity. This is the sphenoidal sinus there. There's also a frontal sinus, which is this big space here in the frontal bone. Cribriform plate of the ethmoid, yes. So we talked about the ethmoid bone being this kind of mysterious bone that's actually quite large. This part of it, you can see here, where all these little tiny holes are, is called the cribriform plate. And all those little holes in the cribriform plate are where the olfactory nerve comes out of the nose and goes back to the olfactory bulb of the brain. So the bulb sits right here, and all these nerves are coming through those holes. I don't. Cribriform means, I guess, like crisscrossed, I think. Okay. Oh, yes, and those would be the cribriform foramina, all the little holes. Perpendicular plate of the ethmoid I mentioned already, but it's this sheet of bone that drops down in the midline here, which actually showed up beautifully on this dog skull right here. That's the perpendicular plate. But you can always see it if you just look in the external areas as that vertical sheet of bone coming down from above, and it's making up the dorsal half of the nasal septum. The ventral half of the nasal septum is a bone coming up from the bottom, and that's the vomer. So if you can look in there, you see there's two bones, and that's perpendicular plate of the ethmoid and the vomer coming up from beneath.
So it's part of the ethmoid?
The perpendicular plate is, the vomer is the vomer, yeah. Okay, we're doing well. Nasal septum, look, I'm ahead of myself. And then the nasal conchae are a little bit hard to see, but all these scrolls of bone that you see here on the side wall of the nasal cavity are the nasal conchae. And like a conch shell that's all curled and scrolled. And the conchae come in three parts that are a little hard to distinguish from each other. But let's see if we can see. Anyway, I'm not going to try to point them out, but there's a dorsal one, a ventral one, and one in between. That's the middle concha. Okay, and we'll just leave it at that. Okay, do we have time to do foramina? Do you want to do foramina? Okay, we're going to do them real quick. All right, so cribriform